Thank you so much.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. It's indeed a privilege to be leading off on what I anticipate is going to be just a fantastic day at the Kolkata Literary Meet. And it puts me, I kind of feel like the embodiment of our topic, which is Brave New Asian. We will be discussing Asian aspiration and ambition. And that's the common thread that links these three authors together. They are all award winners. Up here we have stories in Tash Aw's the five-star billionaire about five very different characters who are seeking their fortunes in New China. We have in Shyam's most recent novel, Hungry Ghosts, about Sri Lankan diaspora, the whole idea of aspiring to something better than one's circumstances outside of Sri Lanka and seeking it without and then returning. And then we have the real life story of an individual who started from really from virtually nothing and rose to the pinnacle of American society and at the top of the corporate ladder, so to speak, the first Indian American CEO of a multinational in The Billionaire's Apprentice, the billionaire, Anita Raghavan's Billionaire's Apprentice. The billionaire is Rajaratnam, who's a Sri Lankan expat, and the apprentice is Rajat Gupta, who is an Indian American who rises to the top of McKinsey Consulting. And under his authority, McKinsey becomes this, undergoes this period of huge expansion and goes through their most profitable period. And the story begins at the White House. He's invited to a White House dinner. And you can't rise too much higher in society than being invited to the White House for a dinner honoring Manmohan Singh. And we see his inevitable fall, even as it chronicles his rise to that level. So let's start with Anita. I mean, when I was first following the Rajat Gupta story in the news, I knew that he was half Bengali, but you know, I didn't really think he had that much of a connection to Calcutta. I knew that he lived in Delhi. But I was surprised to read in your book that this is, you know, his roots in Calcutta and how this is, you know, really a Calcutta story, beginning with his father, whose life could be, you know, regarded as a contrast to that of Rajat Gupta. His was about sacrifice, great personal sacrifice. So why don't we start off with just a brief description about Ashwini Gupta and exactly why his life is a contrast to that of Rajat Gupta.
Sure. Ashwini Gupta was in some ways very much like Rajat. I came to Calcutta 2 years ago and spoke to Rajat's cousins. I sat at their dinner tables and they told me of a young man who was headstrong, who was remarkably handsome, very intelligent, and had a real personal passion, and that passion was fighting for India's freedom. And Ashwini sacrificed a great deal, and I don't want to give away the final chapter of the story, which is entitled A Family Secret, but he did something in 1935 that completely changed the trajectory of his life. It meant that Ashwini, who was a promising economist at what was then Ripon College, would never be able to be an academic again. It would mean that Ashwini would not be allowed to work at the All India Radio. It would mean that every avenue of productive employment would be closed off to Ashwini Gupta, and he would end up coming out of the independence movement in 1947 with 1,000 rupees of debt, which at that time was a huge amount of money.
But he was part of this generation who really sacrificed. They put their own personal ambitions aside in favor of that of the country. And he was like Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose,
Right.
was when he was in prison, intentionally exposed to TB.
That's right.
Among other things.
That's right. And I guess the difference between Ashwini and Subhash Chandra Bose, I mean, we all know about the Subhash Chandra Boses and the Captain Lakshmis who gained great prominence for their freedom fighting efforts. But what was remarkable about Ashwini Kumar Gupta is that he was really one of the many hundreds of thousands of foot soldiers in the freedom movement who didn't really get any public acclaim for their efforts. And as you say, you know, he went through terrible treatment in prison. Rajat talks about this. He was beaten so many times, time and time again, that his back was literally split open, and they had to sew it up. And years later, he would go on walks with Rajat, and he would complain about the great pain that his back would give him, and it was from that time. And then, of course, there was the tuberculosis. And one of the things I was able to unearth, actually in the British Library, was a book that was written by a man who started off as a freedom fighter himself, and then turned and became a jailer for the British, and actually
Maitro is his name, right?
Yes, that's right. And actually rescues Ashwini Kumar Gupta when he's brought to Presidency Jail, which I'm sure is all very familiar to all of you, and gets him the medical help he needs and saves him. And so, you know, while Rajat's story is very much a story of personal gain, Ashwini symbolized what I think India represented at that time, a story of personal sacrifice.
And Rajat came from that generation that's known as, I think you refer to as the twice blessed.
That's right.
And those are people who were born after independence and also benefited from the economic reforms of the 1990s, right?
No, I think it was a generation that was born after independence,
and then went to the
and then
US.
benefited from the great investment that India poured into its educational institutions. Of course, as you all know, the IITs were created in the 1950s, and then came to the United States in the starting in the mid 1960s, when America itself was opening up to foreign faces. Of course, it was a time of the civil rights struggle that had been won, and my own parents, my father came in 1958 on a scholarship to Princeton, and my mother came in 1959 to work at Brooklyn Public Library. And I remember them telling me a story of how when they were at Harvard in the 1960s, they traveled with a Polish couple to the South, and they were weary, and they decided to stop off, and they stumbled upon a restaurant, and the Polish couple was invited to sit at the front of the restaurant, and my parents were asked to eat in the kitchen. And my parents left for Malaysia, but when they came back in the 1970s to the United States, it was a completely different America, or at least it was starting to be a different America.
And this is a common thread. I mean, Shyam, in your novel, your protagonist leaves Sri Lanka mainly to escape, and he has this idea. I mean, we talked about this earlier, that the idea that you know, the West, or you know, the idea of American culture, you know, Canada being kind of, you know, grouped in with that. As this, you know, this this haven for success and for comfort and ultimately for happiness. And then he arrives in Toronto, and in this incredibly spread out city, and feels isolated.
Well, I don't think my mic works. Well, I mean, I think that unlike your protagonist, my protagonist what he's searching is not money but love, basically, and also a chance to be himself, because he knows in Sri Lanka he's gay, and he wants to come to the West because he believes that in the West he'll finally be accepted, he'll finally be able to be his true self, and be loved. But of course, what he doesn't take into account is that when he comes to the West, he's an outsider, and he's not white, and he has to try to negotiate a place for him in a white gay community that is also racist and has very racist stereotypes about what other people are, and sort of very Orientalist stereotypes in terms of desire. And so at one point he says that, he neither belonged in sort of his Sri Lankan world, nor did he belong in the gay world, but he had no choice but to linger on the fringes of the white gay world. And so it's kind of like a hungry ghost, sort of, which is a Buddhist concept of a ghost that sort of lingers just beyond the gateway, of a house that he or she used to live in, but can't enter and can't leave either. So, yeah.
Thank you. And if we could get somebody just to fix Shyam's mic, that would be great. Oh, it does. Okay, great. Tash, have you? This is the Hungry Ghost. Actually, there's also. I mean, it's a Buddhist legend, but very much kind of the Chinese variant of it. And being familiar with Chinese culture, have you come across it in your?
It's something we're brought up with. There's a whole sort of elaborate ceremony, a festival that we have to. We live through every year. It's for children. It's a rather wonderful thing. It's about no school for a day, but it's about offering gifts to appease the ghosts. But more than that, it's another way through which the Chinese diaspora throughout the world connect with their culture. And it's one of the things that for me was very sort of wonderful growing up. So all these things like the Mooncake Festival, the Hungry Ghost Festival, they connected me to a sense of my ancestral culture that was very deep-seated and very profound, because what I saw happening around me was people connecting more and more with Chinese culture in a purely materialistic sense. So for me, it was a counterbalance to ambition.
Right, but the characters in your book, they, in a sense, they make a return to their roots from Malaysia to China, but culture has nothing to do with it. It's purely economic.
No,
right.
You're absolutely right. So unlike Rajiv Gupta and unlike the protagonist in Shyam's novel, my characters have never been to China. They're sort of third, fourth generation Malaysian Chinese. So China for them is a foreign country. So I guess the modern idealistic Hollywood story would be that they then go back to China to find their roots, but instead they're just going to find money. They're going to find a good job, nicer handbags, a rich husband. But the great irony is that they're doing the reverse journey that their grandparents or their great-grandparents did 100 years ago.
Economic reasons as well.
Absolutely, because they left southern China for economic reasons, because at the time, 100 years ago, southern China was incredibly blighted by famine and poverty. So a lot of these immigrants left for Southeast Asia to establish new lives for themselves there, which is exactly what the people of my generation and 10, 20 years younger are doing now, going back to China, being sold on this promise.
Well, I mean, your characters arrive in very much a new China and a new Shanghai. One that is not at all really indicative of a socialist leftist kind of a past, that it's very much it's kind of hyper materialistic, and I think it's really embodied by one of your characters who's just a wonderful creation, and that's Phoebe, who is a girl who was born in the village, and she assumes a new identity in a sense by getting a new identity card, and then becomes rather successful in terms of running a spa, and then but really her main ambition is to become rich by finding a man. Right?
Yeah. It's totally. She's a really, in modern liberal terms, she's really regressive. But actually, she's essentially an embodiment of what I saw going on a lot when I lived in Shanghai, which is that you get these bright, successful, talented young women, and all they want to do is to find a rich husband, and not just rich. I mean, everyone's gunning for a billionaire, because a millionaire has no currency in China these days. I mean, I don't
it's
know
very
what
passé
like in India, and you're right, about the whole. I don't know if any of you has ever been to China, particularly the big cities like Shanghai or Beijing. I mean, they're a socialist country. I mean, it's a communist country, but you see no sign of this at all. It's just rampantly materialistic, and so what Phoebe does is she tries to reinvent herself. In a sense, it's a very American thing. And that's what all these young women are doing in China, in Shanghai, especially in Beijing. They're reinventing themselves. They're girls who've come from the provinces, and they style themselves in a certain way. And to them, the totemic object is the luxury handbag. It's the Louis Vuitton handbag.
Very small luxury handbag.
Yeah. And so, whenever people ask me what this novel is about, I always say it's about love, migration, and handbags, because it's about how that represents the pinnacle of aspirations. You have, I met countless people, secretaries, people on modest but decent incomes, and all they were doing was saving up for a handbag. And so, but until they got that real handbag, they would make do with fakes.
Well, there's a lot of that there. I think there's a lot of symbolism of the fake handbag, the fake branded item, and in a sense, and the symbolism of money provides a fake life in a sense.
Yeah, that's
fake happiness.
Yeah, absolutely. Because and also it's what she's experiencing. She's a fake too, and there's a lot of talk about that object is a real fake. It's a real, genuine fake. Right. But with the thing that I found interesting, talking about Rajiv Gupta and also the escape that happens in Shyam's novel, is that they're both all the characters in my novel are also they're escaping something, and often that something is the burden that's been placed on them by their parents, or their parents' generation, and they're somehow trying to live up for that loss. And I wonder, particularly in Rajiv Gupta's case, how much he was trying his life, that grandeur, that verbosity, that larger-than-life way of living, how much of that was meant to compensate for things that had happened in generations before him, and how much of that he was carrying, or how much of that we all carry without knowing.
Well, I think Rajat Gupta, I mean, when you have to go to sort of his time in Delhi, and when he had lost by that time both his mother and father, right? And become kind of the surrogate parent in his home. He had to take care of his siblings. Right. And which he did dutifully, right?
Right.
So
but to take your question, people have asked me why I chose to include this family secret, which is really quite a dishonorable thing that happened to the Gupta family. And I think the reason I included it is because I remember coming to Calcutta and interviewing one of Rajat Gupta's cousins, and I asked the cousin about the secret, and he sort of shrugged and walked away. And then his wife was sitting there, and she said, "Oh, it was terrible. Dr. Tatini Das, Ashwini's older sister, was appalled when it happened." And at that moment, I realized what great shame this crime that Ashwini had committed had you know, what great shame it had brought to the family. And I think all his life, Rajat knew about this crime, and he knew it was the reason that various avenues of employment had been closed to his father. He knew it was the reason that his family was actually very poor. And he said, you know, after my parents died, if it had not been for my mother, who put aside some money, we would have starved. And I think that was actually a remarkably honest, you know, appraisal of their circumstance. I think, you know, when I first looked at him, when I first started covering him, I saw him as a successful man with well-tailored suits and well-coiffed hair. And it was only coming to Calcutta that I realized how wrenching, you know, a family history he had, and how perhaps that family history had driven him to seek a new life.
Do you think perhaps that he was, you know, there's a lot of repressed anger there at his father? Because, I mean, his father, I mean, just to, without giving away what the secret is, I mean, the crime was committed, you know, not for personal gain. It was committed for, you know, reasons that were